All right, look, let's make a start. Welcome everybody. This afternoon, we have Cullen, who is speaking to us today. He is an academic who has been working at the intersection of contemporary and ancient traditions for many years. Recently, he has supported the work and research of the newly founded Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. He is also a lecturer in philosophy and Christian spirituality at the University of Divinity. And this afternoon, he's going to talk to us on what does recent scientific research into contemplative practices have to contribute to the Christian meditation tradition. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thank you for accepting the conference. And it's somewhat late notice, thanks Doro. Would also like to begin the talk with an acknowledgement of country on Wurundjeri land, and we'd just like to acknowledge the care of country that's enabled us to live and participate in these types of events. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. So with this, I've got the. So let me just see if I've got the control there. Yeah, okay, cool, great. So with this talk, it's partly coming out of extended experience that I've had with working between ancient practices, particularly the work of the desert tradition, but Evagrius Ponticus and Maximus the Confessor, and placing these in dialogue to some of the models of contemporary contemplative research or contemplative science. Which is kind of, as I'll talk to, has exploded in the last 30 years, and it's caused, really quite perhaps revolutionary shifts in how we understand contemplative practices, not just from within Buddhist traditions, but also potentially across a range of different traditions. So because I'm working at that intersection and I've yet to publish on this point, what I can do is I can talk a little bit around some of the general points, and I'm hoping to leave enough time for questions. But at present, I'm a fellow at the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne, and I've been actively working with contemplative researchers for the last 2 years to develop a lot of approaches to that will hopefully extend the types of paradigms or categories that the contemplative researchers have been using recently to engage with much more contextual and religious-based practices, which has not been the case in the last little while. So I'll just talk really briefly about the history of contemplative research, and just to give you an idea of why, in a very broad sense, why Christian contemplative practices, which started off with some as being quite important dialogue partners with the early work in contemplative research in the US, but why the Christian contemplative practices don't seem to have been maintained a consistent contribution in recent times. And then I'll go on to discuss a little bit about how I think most of the contemporary work that I've been looking at in relationship to how to classify different aspects of the cognitive processes that constitute a contemplative practice, such as attention, open monitoring, analysis, and others, to try to make a basic claim that if we apply some of the contemporary models to a text like Maximus the Confessor, or maybe to even someone like Evagrius or others, or Cassian, what we'd find is actually most of the components that you would need to make an argument that Christian contemplative practices are extremely solid and robust and able to give explanations of experiences and effects within meditation are actually there, and that we need to take some time to, in a sense, make those classifications and so that it will provide, I guess, a good kind of solid vocabulary and way of talking between Christian researchers and practitioners and contemplative researchers. So just to begin, sorry, that's a little bit heavy. Okay, so the main thing to say is that contemplative research was mostly focused on the dialogue between psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists. That was the kind of and contemplative practitioners from Buddhist, Hindu, and Christian traditions. So this dialogue was happening mostly during the Mind and Life and was carried out through the work of the Mind and Life group. But initially what we found was that historians and various people who are working in traditions in a variety of ways, including scholars in patristics, were at least there was a great openness toward the engagement from many different disciplines. But what happened over time is that, and I think the basic argument here is that because of the constitution of Christian traditions hadn't really emphasised the systematic engagement with the categories of psychology that were prominent within the contemplative researchers that the contemplative researchers were using, which has meant that over time, despite the generosity of both parties, that the Christian capacity to contribute to the emergence of contemplative research in the last 10 years has dropped off considerably, although there is some work that's still happening. Now, just briefly, it's kind of repeating that. Now, some of the reasons for the tendencies of contemplative research is that it kind of decontextualizes some of the contemplative elements of these various traditions, such as Buddhism, to focus on the meditation practices outside of the religious and cultural and ethical contexts. That's been acknowledged by the researchers quite clearly. The second element too is the focus on introspection as the main description of what contemplative practice should be, which is not necessarily correct at all. Like introspection could be one part of a contemplative practice, but a lot of practices that have, clearly contemplative are things like psalmody, chanting, singing and walking meditation, and a variety of things that have a potential for introspective engagement with consciousness, but it may not be central to the actual practice itself. So because of the focus of the contemplative sciences was maybe a little narrow, what has meant that only those practices that are strictly within that model have been able to be kind of engaged with. And so this left even some of the more religious practices of Tibetan Buddhism and definitely many of the practices of Christianity outside of the paradigm that the contemplative research seems to favour. Also, just to note, and I would go into much more comments on this, but Christian practices are very nested within communities of practice and scripture and in a sense contribute conditions for contemplative practice, but may not necessarily be focused solely on the activity of contemplation. They understand, and this is like any kind, if you go to any Christian monastery, at least within the Western tradition, sorry, Doro, I can't speak to the Eastern perspectives, but if you go to a Tarawara or something, or a Cistercian place, it's very clear that it's a very contemplative community, but you don't see anyone doing what we would say as an introspective meditation practice. They're all doing psalmody, but yet so there's a kind of seems to be a bit of a disjunct. And so basically that's meant that, yes, again, it's kind of supporting the fact that the paradigm of contemplative science was a little bit too narrow to engage some of the basic approaches that Christians presume. Although there's definitely been things like centering prayer and practices of John Main that fit much more closely into the contemplative science model. But there are issues with that that we can talk about. Now, just another point, just to kind of reiterate some of the reasons why the Christian contemplative practices have struggled, is that when Christianity is not in these particular frameworks, it's not concerned with trying to make a comprehensive account of the psychological processes that are involved in meditation practice. They're interested in the psychological processes that lead to certain outcomes, but they're not interested in maybe making a scientific or comprehensive model, even based on a kind of an Aristotelian psychology. They're much more interested in, if you keep your heart free from problematic thoughts and distractions and focus more on God, these are the types of effects that might happen. But it's not really, although the language of, say, Maximus is very consistent with its approach to the psychological processes that go into introspection, it's not attempting to give a comprehensive view. So whereas the Buddhist traditions often did, but it's very, as I say, it's quite consistent. It's another reason why it has kind of dragged a little bit. But so when there's also been there's been some recent developments in contemplative research that has kind of broken down meditation to different categories or different processes. Some of these have been attention, some of them are open monitoring. These are different types of things that you do when you're meditating. And so some of the standard models which were around, I think in the early 2000s, have been, some Christian researchers have taken those models up to actually and applied those to contemporary and historical models to try to understand what the composition of a Christian contemplative practice consists of. So does it have a strong emphasis on attention? Is there a lot of metacognition happening? Or, what types of kind of cognitive processes are happening there? However, so there has been some development in the historical work too. The problem is that that with the explosion of contemplative research, the main categories that have moved from the main categories that we use to describe meditation have moved from two main elements to 7 or even 14. So the number of things that need to be taken into account when you want to give a robust account of a meditation practice have expanded enormously in terms of precision. And for the most part, there are definitely some exceptions, but the Christian researchers have not kept up with that emergent kind of complexity. However, when most of the people I'm working with here, who developed these categories are, Nicholas Van Dam is kind of one of the people who developed these, who's the director of the centre that I worked with. He and I have been talking about how to apply some of the contemporary models to someone like Maximus. And what I've found already is that, everything that you would expect, everything that the contemporary categories are concerned with, such as how attention is applied, where it is applied, the changing character of it over time, all of those factors, if you apply them to the ancient texts, can be seen. And the ancient texts provide clear evidence that these cognitive processes are present, but you can also see what they're doing when they're applied, how they affect the person. So in other words, like if I applied my basic thesis is that if we apply some of the kind of most sophisticated models for describing contemplative practices to ancient texts, we find that they're completely compatible. Up to a certain point, we can't necessarily say anything about the nature of religious experiences yet, but it's most of the things that that a contemplative researcher would want to see if they're trying to understand what a practice looks like in an ancient Christian setting. We can find if we apply the contemporary work. So that's a very kind of positive thing. So I just to give you a little bit of a story and to make sure that Doro knows that I've read the text. But it's just that so Maximus's texts do show evidence of sustained introspection, and you would say, okay, it seems to have evidence, of course, of strong attentional focus, but the terminology I would suggest is making some very interesting claims about the character of the introspection that is peculiar to Christian practices, that is distinctive from a Buddhist approach. What I would do is, if I'd had more time, is that some of the patristic research classifies Christian traditions as being concerned primarily with attention. I would say it seems to be correct, but actually what I would argue is that what the Christian, at least in Maximus, the practices seem more like a sustained awareness or sustained receptivity. Now, although the attentional focus comes out of that sustained receptivity too, the attitudinal difference with how the practices are undertaken, it can be quite considerable. So in this, at least at the preliminary stage, being able to identify what are the distinctive elements of the processes that are occurring with introspection arguably do show that Maximus's approach to introspection has some quite important and distinctive features that move it away from, say, a mindfulness practice. So what we would find if we wanted to talk about, further on, we'd say that the sustained receptivity model that I would argue is prominent in the Christian, at least in Maximus, actually also potentially gives an explanation for why the experience of God has a particular type of a particular way of experiencing God is concerned with receptivity rather than sustained attention. That would be my argument, but that's a kind of a specialist point. So those are the terms. There's other elements related to experience experiences of thoughts and complex objects within the consciousness also show clear evidence of introspection and a variety of different types of cognitive processes, including analysis and examination and sustained examination. So what this is showing that, you have, different classifications of thoughts or as distractions. This classification process is important. It's also shows us quite a sophistication with how it's been done. But you also see that there's clear evidence of analysis being used within the introspection, which again is an important point to make. When it comes to temptations and things like demons and passions, it's also showing that the introspection is engaging with things, what you would say, causal analysis or the analysis of transcendent objects, things that are not clearly disclosed within the immediate engagement with consciousness, which suggests things that would approximate something like a Buddhist path of insight. So that's, again, another point. And then we have also got these things where we talk about negative theology, so to speak, where we're talking about the sustained experience of the divine mystery. That more work needs to be done to see what that is, but it's just, again, it's showing that the Christian practices have this highly sophisticated process. Now, all of this is really basic. Yeah, it's all really basic. It's basically saying and Dora will say, well, that's really obvious. It's all very obvious. The problem has been that there's not been any sustained work that's been done to actually explicate how these various cognitive processes are evident within the Christian traditions. There's just hasn't been anyone who's done it. And so the consequence of this being that when, say, something like centering prayer, which it's basically derived very much from Evagrius and Maximus and texts like this, the contemporary Christian approaches don't really have the same sophistication of psychological language that's clearly evident within the ancient texts. But yeah, that's so we could just kind of talk a little bit about that. But what I would do is basically say that all of these various factors of Maximus show, a kind of a capacity to kind of navigate the internal space with a great degree of sophistication and mastery. So given the time, I might finish up there and just say, look, just to make a general point that the ancient Christian sources have evidence of sustained introspection with a great deal of sophistication that will enable quite a deep dialogue between historical work in Christian practices and contemporary Christian practices with contemplative researchers, contemporary contemplative scientists. And just to make that basic point and to say that although we're a long way from talking about religious experiences, that I don't see there's any problem with doing that in the future. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Great, Colin. Now you won't be surprised. Doru's got a question. Doru, would you be able to just unmute yourself and you can ask the question directly to Colin?
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you very, very much, Colin. Well, it's not a question as more of a comment, and you are right. At least in Eastern Orthodoxy, there isn't an explicit concern with the theory and practice of meditation, contemplation, and so on and so forth. But that's at the surface. As a matter of fact, there's this kind of reluctance to address these matters, at least in public, including for inquisitive researchers like you. The idea is, this is something that Eastern Orthodoxy somehow inherits from late antiquity. There's this practice of disciplina arcani, keep things in-house, and discuss with them plainly only with people who are in your backyard. So this isn't a matter of elitism or stuff like that. It's more a matter of practicality, because you don't want people to get mad, go with the fairies because of trying on their own this kind of stuff. This is just a thing you have to dig deeper, and especially it's a matter of being there in their presence in order to get a gist of what they do, because they do.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And just to speak, I don't like to speak too personally, but I've been, practicing meditation since I was 18, and so for me the engagement with it's obviously it's a deep experience, and it's a deeply experiential tradition that I guess I think that the work that I'm concerned with here and doing this here is because the mystery conversation, after a while, it becomes difficult. It's like it involves a lot of trust. It involves the trust of the community. You have to feel trust. You have to trust the community that you're going in to understand or try to spend time with. You have to have a sense or like a trust of the practices that you're doing. And I think one of the problems, as we know, is that like Christians haven't done very well at maintaining a trustworthy spaces. And I guess the thing is, for me, is that concerns me is to say, okay, some of this stuff's okay. It has something to it. And it shouldn't necessarily be, we shouldn't be worried too much about it. So I see it as like a kind of more of an apologist. I come to it as more of an apologist than anything.
Thank you, Cullen. We don't have a lot of time for any more questions, but is there one quick question somebody might have online, or?
I'm just thinking from a really big picture. I've been listening to probably more Eastern things, finding they're quite helpful, and a sort of absence of conversations in most Christian circles around this stuff unless you know where to go. And there's this sense that there's real keys for humanity in dealing better with our inner world so that we can resolve some of the massive challenges in our outer world. I don't want to say the real world, it's all real. What's your sense being in that space in terms of us learning to respond rather than react? There's this anger, this journey towards peacefulness and attentiveness and holding space. I'm finding always really helpful resources kind of quite far outside the walls of the church. Do you see hope that these things are going to be restored, or better collaboration and conversation?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because, and this is the reason why I had the urgency around the vocabulary, because honestly, I don't see much. It's not it's a conversation around where the communities are at, but I think that we have to accept that in the last 10 years, there's been massive changes to the character of institutions that hold or that held things like contemplative practices for the Christian space, but changes to sheer economics has meant that it's actually very hard to have that sustaining conversation when pretty much we're faced with a very few people who can have that conversation. So I think it would need a longer conversation about that.
That's great. Thank you. Can you join with me in thanking Cullen once again for his great talk? Thank you.